Matthew chapter 1. Okay. And we're going to be reading the first 18 verses. Let's read God's word this morning. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez the father of Hezron. Hezron the father of Ram. Ram the father of Amminadab. Amminadab the father of Nahshon. Nahshon the father of Salmon. Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Ruth. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Solomon the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam the father of Abijah, Abijah the father of Asa, Asa the father of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat the father of Jehoram, Jehoram the father of Uzziah, Uzziah the father of Jotham, Jotham the father of Ahaz, Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, Manasseh the father of Ammon, Ammon the father of Josiah, Josiah the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, Zerubbabel the father of Abuhad, Abuhad the father of Eliakim, Eliakim the father of Azor, Azor the father of Zadok, Zadok the father of Akim, Akim the father of Eliud, Eliud the father of Eleazar, Eleazar the father of Matan, Matan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, who's called the Messiah. Thus there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David. 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. This is God's word this morning. So Christmas 2 years ago, there was a big hullabaloo. Not in my house, but in many houses, because the PlayStation 5 had been released. And the PlayStation 5 sold out in record time for a console at that point. So much so that even here in Newry, if you went on to Newry Buy and Sell, you would find PlayStations that had been bought originally for about £400 being put up the same day for £700, £800. You even seen some mad purchases on eBay for £1,000, £600 over the asking price. People loved and wanted the PlayStation 5. And I think for many of us here, we would ask, what is the big deal? But if we ask someone here who had the PlayStation 4 and wanted a PlayStation 5, they would point us to the graphics cards, the improvements in sound technology, the shock controller that no other console had at the time. But for most of us, we would ask the question, well, why is it a big deal? And I think we do this a lot with life, don't we? If you're not into football and everyone in work is talking about football, you're sitting there trying to wait for that conversation to end. You're in school waiting for that conversation to end, and you're going, why is football such a big deal? But to some people, it's life or death. Or even food. Maybe you think fish is absolutely stinking. You're wrong, but you do. There's nothing worse for you than some delicious mussels straight out of their shell, some tasty cod, some rich monkfish where you're still getting the bones in your teeth. I love that, but maybe for you, you're going, why would anyone enjoy that? Why do people pay an arm and a leg to eat fish? Why is fish a big deal? And we have the same question today. Our passage asks the same question. Why is Jesus a big deal? Maybe you've heard the Christmas story before. Maybe you've never heard it before. Maybe you've never talked deeply about it. And you're wondering, why is Jesus such a big deal? Why is it so important that Christians gather every year for a month and think about Jesus being born? Why is it so important that, our entire calendar is based around this event, the birth and the coming of Jesus? And Matthew has a very simple answer in this genealogy. He says, Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the Messiah. That's another word for Jesus is the King. The Jews of the Old Testament were looking forward to this King, to this Messiah. And the word Messiah in Greek is Christ. In Hebrew, it's Messiah. So it's been translated here as Messiah. We often think of Jesus Christ. Christ is his second name. It's a title. It means he is the King. The King that was expected. The King that was promised. The King everyone had waited for. Jesus is the King that fulfills the Old Testament. And that's why this genealogy is given. It maybe looks like a boring list of names, but it's actually a mandate, a manifesto. I wonder if during election times you've ever got into your letterbox those little party leaflets with the candidates, and most of the time they end up straight in the bin, don't they? But if you were ever to actually take one and open it up, you would see inside it each candidate, whether SDLP, DUP, Sinn Féin, UUP, each of them has in there their mandate, their manifesto, their promises of what they are going to do, their promises of who they are and their pedigree, and why that would make them a fitting candidate for you to vote for. And this is exactly what Matthew is doing with his genealogy. For us, a list of genealogies are simply just tracing back your lineage. For Jews, for the ancient world, your lineage added credibility. It established your reputation. It showed who you were, where you came from, and what you were capable of. So Matthew gives us a mandate, a manifesto of Jesus the King here. And he splits it up into the three most important instances in the Jewish world. He begins with Abraham and goes all the way to King David, their most important and most promising king. Then he goes from the king to the exile, and then he goes from the exile to the coming of Jesus. It says if you were to split up, for example, American history, you go from colonization to independence. You go from independence to their civil war, and from their civil war all the way to probably World War II, and continue from there. And the question that's being asked is, why is Jesus a big deal? And we have 3 points this morning, very briefly, from this genealogy to show why is Jesus a big deal? Why is this king a big deal and the real deal? First we see Jesus is the king to all. Jesus is the king to all. So looking at verses 2 to 6, Jesus is the king to all. Matthew begins with Abraham. He begins with the founder of the Jewish nation. And what he's really doing here is two things. He's establishing Jesus' credibility, because the Messiah, the promised king, had to be Jewish. And he's showing Jesus was Jewish. But also he's pointing back to what Abraham was promised long ago. Abraham was promised many things. And one of the things he was promised was a child who would establish his people, a child who would establish his nation. And we get part of that promise fulfilled in the birth of Isaac. But Matthew's pointing out, look, Abraham was also hoping for this Messiah. And this Messiah comes from his line, just as God promised. And this Messiah, this King, this Christ, is Jesus. But let's keep working down here. Because if you're ever reading the genealogies in the Bible, what you need to look out for is what's unusual, what changes. If you're ever trying to figure out what's the point of including this list of names, you need to look for what's different from the rest. And if you look at verse 3, it says, if you look at, verse 2, it says, Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. And we almost get no other mention of siblings in this. We get Perez and Zerah, but they were twins, so that was unusual, so that's why they're mentioned. And we get the brothers who were taken off to exile. But why does Judah get mentioned here, and his brothers? Well, Philip read out the verse for us earlier, didn't he? From Genesis 49:10. That Judah would have a scepter, it would rule over his brothers, over all the tribes of Israel. And from Judah's line, from Judah's children, will come a king, a promised king who would rule over the other nations. So what's Matthew doing here? He's pointing out that Jesus is not only the promised child Abraham waited for, he's the king that Judah was promised. The ruler Judah was promised. But you know what's more unusual about this? In verses 2 to 6, there's a mention of 4 women. If you look at the rest of those list of names, apart from Mary at the end, we don't see another woman's name mentioned. And lineages, genealogies, royal lines, all those things were traced often through the father. So while it's never not unheard of to see a woman's name in here, it is unusual. And to see 4 women. And let me point out something about these women. Who do we have? We have Tamar, we have Rahab, we have Ruth, and we have Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. And there's two things that join these women together. First, let me point out, each of them had, sorry, the heater's blowing my Bible. Each of them had sexually questionable backgrounds. Tamar slept with her father-in-law. Ruth had that pretty risque moment with Boaz, where she slept at his feet in the middle of the night, where she snuck up and slept at his feet. Rahab, in fact, was a prostitute, and Uriah had an affair. Or not Uriah, Bathsheba had an affair. So what is Matthew doing, including these names? These surely aren't the names of people you would respect. He's actually showing Jesus comes for the sinners of this world. Jesus comes for the sinners of this world. But there's something more important that he's doing here. Tamar was a Canaanite. Rahab was a Canaanite, so they weren't Jewish. They weren't from Israel. Ruth was from Moab. Again, not from Israel. And Bathsheba, well, we don't know where she was from, was married to a Hittite. Again, not an Israelite. And this is a huge deal, because the Jewish people thought that the Messiah was coming mostly for the nation of Israel. But what we see here is the Jewish Messiah is not just king of Israel, but he's king over all. He comes to reach the Gentiles. He comes to reach those who are not Jewish. That's me, that's you, that's every single one of us here. So we see the rule of this king is for all people, everywhere. That means the claims of Jesus aren't just for Israel 2,000 years ago. The claims of Jesus extend on you and on me. They extend on all of us to say he is our king, and we should recognize him as such. So that means whether you like it or not, Jesus is your king. And that will have huge implications at the very end of this passage. But the next thing we see is Jesus is a king like David. A king like David. If you notice in verse 6 there, Matthew points out David's title. None of the rest of the guys who come next, even though they're all kings, Uzziah, Hezekiah, none of the rest of them get called king. And what is Matthew pointing out? Matthew is pointing out to the promises of the Old Testament. He's showing Jesus fulfills the Old Testament. In 2 Samuel 7 verse 12, we get this. This is God talking to David. And he says, when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build my house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. We see a promise to David early on that God would send a king from his line who would follow him faithfully and who would lift up the nation, who would rule forever, who would never be knocked down, who would never have an enemy who could overpower him, who could always bring peace, tranquility, and prosperity to his people. We don't get that with his son Solomon. His son Solomon builds the house to the Lord. He builds a temple to worship God, but he also walks away from him. And then what comes after that is actually two kings who break the nation, who split it in half, who have a civil war. So we don't get any promising signs. We get, in fact, a very mixed bag of names. You work through that list. Yes, there's some good kings who loved God, but none of them ruled forever. None of them established God's name. All of them had flaws. Yet what's David promised here? He's promised a king who would rule with justice, who would rule with the honor of the Lord. So he's highlighting King David to say Jesus is a king like David. He's a king like David. One of the things you might hear about this passage, maybe you've never heard this, is that there are some names missing. And that's correct. There are some names missing. He gives us 14 names in that little section there between King David and exile. But there were other kings. There was Joash. There was Amaziah. They're not mentioned. So did Matthew make a mistake? Did he actually mess up? Can we not trust this account? Or was he doing something else? And I think it's fairly clear if we look at the passage carefully. He was doing something else. He was making a powerful point. One of the things we never see mentioned in the early critiques of Christianity by Jewish people, by rabbis, by those who know the Jewish scriptures, is that Matthew messed up on the genealogy. Why? Because they actually understood what Matthew was doing too. They disagreed with what he was doing. They disagreed with his point, but they understood the point he was making. They didn't see him as making a mistake or being dishonest. Instead, because they could have just looked this up. Instead, they understood the point he's making, but they disagreed with it. And what's the point he is making? If you look at verse 17, he says there's 14 generations between Abraham to David, 14 from David to exile, 14 from exile to Jesus. And he mentions this number 14 3 times. And that's because every Hebrew letter had a corresponding letter. Every consonant, they didn't have vowels. I don't know how they spoke without vowels, but anyway, they got by. It had a corresponding letter. And the name David matches up to 3 different letters. It's D-V-D, 4 DVDs. And D, Dalet, is 4, V, Vav, is 6, and D is 4 as well. Paul, you're a maths teacher. Can you add those numbers up for us quickly? 14. So what is the point he is making? He's making the point that Jesus is a king like David. That's why he goes back to the 14. That's why he skips some of the names. That's why he only highlights certain kings. He's pointing out that Jesus is a king like David. He's a king that was promised to David, the king David looked forward to. And finally, Jesus is the king that restores. He's the king that restores. The last list of names from verse 12 to verse 16 is full of people who we don't know. We don't have them recorded in the rest of the Bible, except for Zerubbabel and Shealtiel. We don't see anything about them in Jewish culture. They're essentially nobodies. And that's pretty clear by the time we get to the man who would adopt Jesus and protect Jesus, Joseph. Joseph was a carpenter, which probably meant his father Jacob was a carpenter, which probably meant his father was a tradesman or a farmer or a carpenter. These guys are nobodies. They're anonymous. And if you're expecting a king, you don't just pull some random guy off the street, don't you? Do you? You don't just go to Barcroft and declare Padraig King of Ireland. You don't go to Swindon and declare George King of England. You look through the lines and see who's the rightful heir to be king, who has the pedigree, comes from the right family to be king. But what do we see about Jesus? We don't see he comes from the best family. We see he comes from a list of nobodies. And I think that's a powerful point that Matthew's making. He's saying that Jesus does not run away from our state. That he sees how helpless we are. He sees how sinful we are. He sees the nobodies of this world. And instead of running away from them, he enters in alongside them. But we begin at the exile in verse 12, and we end with the Messiah in verse 16. And there's a sense that the Jewish people never really returned from exile. Yeah, they rebuilt the temple, but they never had a Davidic king again. They never had a king in the line of David again. Yeah, they rebuilt the temple, but they never had the glory of God dwelling in it. Yes, they returned to the land, but even now, when Jesus comes, they're slaves to the Romans. There's a sense where they never returned. And what does Jesus come to do? He comes to end the exile once and for all, and to bring people back to God. To bring them not just from the physical exile, not from political exile, but from spiritual exile. Those who are far away from God, and he comes to bring them back. And as we look at Jesus entering into the world this season, it strikes me how different Jesus is to those other people who would set themselves up as the people's king. I think of Mao Zedong in China. He came from a reasonably poor family. He said he was the president, the leader for the working class, for the farmers, for the peasants, for the unlearned. And when he came to power, what did he do? He forced through a famine, killing millions of people. He used his people as resources. He used them as slaves. But what do we see with Jesus? Jesus doesn't come to make people slaves, but he comes as a servant himself. What do you see with Jesus? Jesus doesn't come to use us as a resource, but he is the resource himself, who dies on the cross for our sin. And I think the coming of Jesus challenges a big part of our culture, a big part of how we all think about life. And that's that we think we're all left on our own, that the world will keep going as it always does. And that's not a positive thought. Maybe for a handful of people, they would like life to keep going as it always does for them. But for most of us, we would like things to get better. But you can see that across the world, there's a general gloominess with the way the world is going. People are fed up. That's why we see different political candidates that have never been elected before being brought to power. Why? Because people want change. They want to try something new because they don't want things to keep going as they are. It's why we see so many teenagers, so many young people anxious about the climate. Why? Because they're so worried that things will keep going the way they are, and they think that spells ruin. It's why we see so many people buying into Christmas with such joy and intensity. Why? Because it makes us feel better. Because for the rest of the year, life is pretty gloomy. Yes, we have bright spots in there, but for most of the year, there's plenty of stuff to drag us down, to wear us down, to rub down the nub on the pencil until you can't use it anymore. But Christmas makes us feel better. It reminds us of some of the good things in life to be enjoyed, doesn't it? It reminds us of family. What a blessing. It reminds us of friendship. Again, what a blessing. Even food. It helps us to enjoy good food, which is a gift from God. And we think, well, this is a nice time of year. It's why we buy into it. But there's going to be a point, and there's a point for all of us, where it falls flat. Maybe it's on Christmas Day, where you have your family over, and there's bickering, and you go, why? Why do I do this every year? It doesn't seem as special as it was. Maybe it's on St. Stephen's Day, Boxing Day, where the Christmas high is worn down, and you're going, now I have another year ahead. Or maybe it's on the 1st of January, where you think, well, what do I need to do to better myself for this year? What do I need to have a better year than I did last year? There's going to be a point where it falls flat for all of us. And we think this is the way things are always going to be. We're fed up with the world and we feel we're left on our own. But what Jesus is coming does is punches a big hole in that idea. It punches a big hole right in reality. Why? Because God is not distant. He has not left us on our own. He has come in the person of His Son, Jesus Christ, to be your King, to be your Christ, to be your Messiah, to change the way the world goes, to make the world better, to bring us back from the exile, to rule over us all, and to bring us into His joy. That's why we can rejoice at this time of year. Not because we remember some of the many good things in life that we have, and they are good, but because we have been promised a King who will rule forever and who will lead His people in rejoicing forever, who rules over all people, like David, restoring us to God, and that one day He will return to fulfill the rest. So let's ask the question again. Why is Jesus a big deal? Why is Jesus a big deal? The answer is because it's what Israel waited for. It's what Israel waited for, and it's what the world needed. Jesus is the King. He's the Davidic King. Jesus is the King that for all, and Jesus is the King that restores. And what's Matthew doing then by giving us this long list of names? He's saying to the people, he's writing to his readers, and he's saying, here is your King. He's tracing it down from Abraham, and he's saying, he checks all the boxes, and here he is. So what is the response? Obey him. Obey him. Bow down before him. And sometimes we need this reminder, don't we? We spend so much of our time as a church thinking about how Jesus is our friend, how He's our brother, how He steps down to our level, how He stoops low for us, so low, lower than we could ever go, so low He dies on the cross. But we forget that Jesus is our King. That not only is what He tells us to do good advice, but it actually is a command. It's something we should follow. That means this season when He tells us to not self-indulge, to not think of ourselves first, but to think of His glory and His kingdom first, we should listen. That means, very practically, the blessing of food is good, but we should not indulge in gluttony or in selfishness with this. Yes, we can have a good meal. Yes, we can have a few extra treats. We can enjoy the good things God has given us, but they should not be what our joy is based on. They should point us to the one who's given us those good gifts. They should point us to the one who should satisfy us, so that we don't need to have the whole box of celebrations in one go, or so that we don't feel the need to stock up so much that we're like a greedy squirrel coming into winter time. Instead, we should share what we've been given and think, what do I not need that I can bless someone else with? It also means we should evangelize. The good news is the King is here, so we should tell others the King is here. That means this season, your kids will be there, your family will be there, your grandkids will be there. Evangelize your kids, evangelize your grandkids. Tell them the good news, the King is here for them. Take part maybe in some of the extra activities we have on this month as a church to tell people the good news about Jesus. And finally, we're reminded, if the King is here and we're to obey him, that obedience to the King is the right thing to do. We've so many things coming our direction, so many messages, so many desires calling us to follow and obey them. And maybe we think at times we're wavering, we're going, well, maybe there's something more fruitful to do in my time. Maybe there's something more enjoyable to do in my time than obeying Christ, than following what he commands, than denying myself. And we're reminded here, obedience to Christ is the right response to him. Why? Because he is the King, and therefore he has a right to demand of us. But in bowing down, we also have a sense of worship, a sense of rejoicing. So let's think of some ways we can rejoice. How can we rejoice? Some explicit ways. Because worship can be your whole life. You can eat a meal to worship God. You can have a conversation to worship God. But let's think of explicit ways where we're worshipping God clearly. So one of the things is to look forward to these gatherings. I don't know about you, but all week I've been thinking about the coming of Jesus, and that's filled my heart with a desire to sing praise to him with his people. To go, this is what you've come to do, Lord. So let us come together. Let's listen. Let's pray. Let's sing together out of worship for what you have done. He's come to build this group of people. So let us look forward to these little oases in probably the most busy time of year for most of us, where we can come and be God's people, but more importantly, we can be in his presence, praising him. Another practical way is if you're big into Christmas, or even if you're minimally into Christmas, you probably have a few Christmas CDs, maybe a Christmas Spotify playlist, a YouTube playlist, and you like to listen to some Christmas music occasionally. Let me encourage you, why not mix that up? Yes, have your jingle bells, have all those are great, but every 4 or 5 songs, have a Christmas hymn, have one of those classic Christmas carols that exalt God, and sing along with that, so that you're never more than 20 minutes away from praising the Lord, so that your mind is constantly turned back to what this season is about. Or, we encourage you to get deep in study of why Jesus came. Study God's Word, or maybe read a book. And if I were to recommend a book, I'd say On the Incarnation by Athanasius. It's one of the most important books in church history, and it's actually one of the most accessible. The language is really good, and even greater news, like God's grace for us, it's free online. So maybe read that. Take some time to study God. So how can we also rejoice in what God has done? We can expect. Because Jesus' coming is a reminder that he will come again. It's a reminder that not only has he come once in the past, but he will return. Not only has he come to bring his kingdom, to restore people to God, but he will come one day to finish that work. He will come one day to complete everything that he's done. Yes, he has taken our sin, but he will come to wipe it completely away one day. To take it. Yes, he has come to, he promises that he will heal all of us, but he will come one day to take away death for good. So it's a reminder to expect. So let's be explicit in our worship, and let's expect for his coming. And to help with that, after we're done in just a second, we're going to sing together in praise of what God has done. But more importantly than how we rejoice, more importantly than how we bow down before him, is why we bow down before him. And Matthew's doing something very simple. Look, we're making points that, yes, here's your king and you should obey him, and yes, you should rejoice in him. But Matthew at a very basic level is going, here is Jesus. That's all he's doing. He's showing us the king that was to come. He's revealing to us Jesus. And why do we rejoice? Why? Because Jesus has come. Philip read out some wonderful verses pointing to Jesus, the king that was to come. But one of the things that fills us with joy is that Jesus is the king to come who fulfills the Old Testament. Earlier we read out this verse from Isaiah chapter 9. And why do we rejoice that the King has come? Because this is the King who promises to rule forever, the King whose kingdom cannot be shaken, the King who brings justice, the King who says to the woman being abused in her home that no one knows about, that's not going to happen anymore. The King who says to the person who feels a great sense of guilt and shame that they were a drug addict and no matter what they do, they can never atone for what they've how they've hurt their family. He says to them, no longer is that a problem because I forgive you. The King who says to the 40-year-old with cancer with 3 kids, I will take that from you. The King who promises to make all things right one day. The King who really says the world is not left on its own. It's not heading for disaster. The world is heading for something better. It's heading for me. It's not just about what he does, it's about who he is. The focus of our joy is on Jesus. Why we rejoice is simply because Jesus is the King who was promised. We see in here, Jesus is the King of the nations. Jesus is the King promised by God. Jesus is the King who brings stability. Jesus is the King who brings peace. Jesus is the King who's wise and just. The King who knows our anonymity. The King who does not begrudge his people. The King who glorifies God. The King who cannot be shaken from his power. He's God's promised King who came to rule and will return one day to reign. Let's rejoice now and let's expect for what is to come.